So, Dior is in more trouble than it was before, and if you don't know what's been going on, let me catch you up to speed. A few months ago, Italian investigators opened an investigation into factories used by Dior and Armani, amongst many other brands. During the investigation, they actually found that workers were being hired illegally. They were forced to sleep inside the factory and work really long hours, including nights and holidays, in an unsafe environment. It also came out that a Chinese-owned supplier sold bags to Dior for €53 each, bags that then will retail for over €2,000. And of course, when this story broke, there was a lot of outrage on social media. A lot of people were very angry that, their expensive bags actually really cost not a lot to make because, brands, they've tried for so long to keep this sort of fake air of luxury and exclusivity and quality and craftsmanship. And so people just assume that I'm paying this much money, so there must be some interesting techniques, or, the fabrics must be the best fabrics we've ever seen, or, it must be made by some specialized family in France or in Italy, in the Tuscan region, making leather goods and bags, and they've been making it for 10 generations in a row. I feel like these are the assumptions that people have with luxury fashion, unfortunately. So due to these reasons, the Italian subsidiary of Dior was actually put under court administration for failing to do their due diligence and actually to, oversee their production and know what's going on in their supply chain. They did kind of get off by a technicality because technically they were working with third-party factories. It's not like these are Dior factories. And so now the investigation is mainly on the factories and the owners of the factories themselves, rather than focusing on just Dior or Armani solely. And not that you needed any proof, but I guess this is more proof that luxury brands just don't care. These brands don't care. It's all about making money at the expense of anything else. If you guys know about designers like Dries Van Noten, who I talk about a lot, in the Dries Van Noten documentary, there's a section where he has a team member that moved to India because Dries Van Noten used to do a lot of the beautiful appliques and the embroidery and all the craftsmanship that, is really, really well known in India. So he had a representative from the brand go there and actually make sure that things are being produced to a certain quality level, actually make sure that, there's a certain standard when it comes to making the Dries Van Noten clothing. And so if Dries Van Noten, who, if we're talking about scale, doesn't even make close to as much money as Dior, is not as famous as Dior, the scale is not as big. Even the brand that owns Dries Van Noten is nowhere as big as LVMH. So LVMH has way more resources. Surely they can have a representative. This is if they cared, of course. They could have a representative go to these factories, vet the factories, make sure that things are being done to a certain standard, ensure that workers aren't under these insane living conditions. And so because they're not doing that, despite them having the resources to, it just means that they just don't care. That's just the crux of the issue. They say we're doing all these sustainability things and all these sustainable initiatives. It falls on deaf ears because, once again, they don't really have representatives going to these places and vetting them and making sure that they're being held to a certain standard. And I would say that I kind of was slightly surprised when this news first broke, that people were surprised, because I thought at least that it was very well documented how exploitative a lot of these companies can be, especially in factories in Italy. I think people just have this assumption that these bad working conditions are only going on in Bangladesh or, Vietnam, Cambodia, places that are very known for exploiting workers in like the fast fashion space. But I think people think that luxury fashion brands are far removed from that. They don't produce in China, which a lot of them do, or they don't produce in these places. And even in Italy, they just assume, okay, if it's made in Italy or if it says made in Britain or, made in France, then it must be something that's in a humane way. There's kind of, people being paid fair wages, people being treated fairly because there are labor laws in these countries. But just because there are labor laws in a country doesn't mean that they're actually enforced. It's actually very hard to enforce all of these laws. And actually, it takes a lot of resources and government money and spending to stay on top of it, which is why you can have all these laws all you want, but it comes down to if they're enforced and if people actually follow the laws, which a lot of these factories and brands don't. So it's well documented that a lot of times these factories use undocumented workers and undocumented immigrants to work in these factories. Now, the reason they do this is because they're undocumented, they basically don't have a choice on many jobs. They don't have a lot of options. So this being one of their few options, these, owners of these factories and the managers there just take the absolute piss. And they essentially, there are stories where a lot of these factory workers get assaulted, like SA'd, or R-worded. They're exploited in so many different ways. They're locked up in factories. This is in Italy, by the way, because people always assume that, it's only in different countries that these things happen, not in European countries. So all these things happen, and it's well documented. A journalist that I talk about all the time, Dana Thomas, who I'm a big fan of course, has written about this in multiple books. In the book that I'm always talking about, which has kind of become a broken record at this point, How Luxury Lost Its Luster, Dana Thomas wrote about the fact that there are quite muddy laws in the EU when it comes to the country of origin labels. So you have a lot of cases where brands will make a bag in a completely different country and then they just kind of finish it with, they apply the last bit of hardware on the bag, or the last bit of a handle, and then they can say it's made in Italy because that last bit was done in Italy or that last bit was done in France. And so because there are all these muddy country of origin label laws, you don't really know where your bag is made, even if it says made in Italy. And there are issues from all angles. If it's made elsewhere where companies exploit labor laws, then you know what the issue is there. If they're made in Italy, like completely made in Italy, you don't know what factory in Italy it's made in. They could be using undocumented workers that are being exploited and, SA'd and very horrific things like that. So from all angles, it's all problematic. And there are so many documentaries about this, even not just the fashion industry now. There are so many articles and documentaries that have come out in Italy, once again, where they were using undocumented workers to work on farms and using their labor, and the same issues that I said happen in the factories, these are the same issues that happen on these Italian farms. So it's a big issue in Italy, not just Italy, a lot of European countries. I'm just mentioning Italy because it's a big focus in this story, because that was where the initial inquiry was made and the initial investigation was happening. And I was just talking about undocumented workers. There are workers that have citizenship in Italy that are still exploited and treated badly and go through terrible working conditions. And I read about this a while ago in the New York Times, like years ago. I'll see if I can put the article on the screen. But yeah, so in a nutshell, it's definitely a mess. And this is something that I thought was common knowledge, which is why, once again, I was really surprised by the shock from people when this was reported, because I just thought that, yes, this has been happening forever and it's constantly reported. Unfortunately, because these brands and companies don't care, are they going to change it? No. And so a few days ago, there was a new development that Dior breached the UK's modern slavery disclosure requirement. And the main place that has been investigating this and reporting this is Reuters. So I'll leave a link to this in the chat and I'll pin it. So if you want to read the article, you can essentially read it. But I'll be reading out some key points from the article just to kind of discuss it and kind of share my thoughts. So in the UK, there's a Modern Slavery Act which requires companies in the UK with a turnover of over £36 million, which is $46 million, to publish an annual statement which will detail the steps that they're taking to combat forced labor in their business and supply chains globally. Now, we've already come to the conclusion that these brands don't care about this stuff, because if they did, they would have representatives all over the place. It would literally be some people's full-time job just to make sure that everything is in check in all these places. And the fact they don't have all these kind of people in place shows that they don't care. So them being behind on this documentation doesn't surprise me at all, because it doesn't strike me that, these companies actually care about these things. And so in the case of Dior's UK subsidiary, the main issue was that they hadn't updated their documents since 2020 until quite recently, last month. So to read directly from the article, it says, the investigation prompted Europe's top asset manager, Amundi, and other investors to ask LVMH to take more aggressive steps to monitor its suppliers' treatment of workers. these investors have told Reuters. We have been preparing an up-to-date modern slavery statement, which has now been published on our website, Dior said in a written statement on July 19th in reply to Reuters. And as of the 5th of August, which is very recent, just a few days ago, and also the day before this article from Reuters was published, they had only updated these documents for the most recent year, but it's not updated for 2021 and 2022. So that's something that is still outstanding. And something that I want to read to you guys, which I found quite interesting, was that I wanted to kind of see if I could find out what are the penalties for not doing these things on time? What are the issues that might arise? What would happen to the company? And I actually found this part in the article, and I was so surprised when I read what they said about it. So what they said was, although publishing the statement is mandatory by law, no company has been penalized for not complying, according to Sarah Thornton, Professor of Modern Slavery Policy at the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab. Some lawmakers and rights groups are pushing for penalties to be introduced. Now, that was really shocking to me, that there are no penalties, even though that it's a legal requirement. No one has ever been penalized for not doing it, which is why if you don't penalize someone for not doing something, they're obviously not going to do it, or it's not going to be a high priority of theirs. It's not something that they're going to be doing a lot, especially because they know they have issues with their supply chain. This has been proven. This is not speculation. It's been proven by the investigation into the factories in Italy, which they owned up for and said that they'll do more in terms of making sure that they have a better control of their supply chain. So this is not speculation. This is just factual. So yeah, there should be more penalties. I'm happy that people are pushing for more penalties, and, you know, these companies need to be held more accountable for these things. So yeah, that's the big update on this story. I shall continue to update you further as things go on. Definitely read the article because there's way more information in the article, but I didn't want to bore you with all the details. But on that note, I'll be back with another video very soon, and thank you very much for watching. This YouTube channel runs on your support. If you want to support the channel, you can subscribe to my Patreon. You'll gain access to exclusive content that includes everything from my Patreon podcast, where I give a behind-the-scenes insight into the fashion industry, as well as a fashion book club, where I review my favorite fashion books. You can also check out my fashion ebook, which highlights the best fashion journalists to follow, definitions of common fashion terminology, and how to determine what a good source of fashion information is. The links to everything are in the description below.